For weeks, astronomers believed 3I Atlas was fading into the darkness, just another interstellar wanderer that would pass by the sun and disappear. But now, new data suggests something no one expected. The object hasn't left. It's changing. At first, the shift was almost imperceptible. A slight alteration in trajectory, a faint brightening that could be dismissed as solar reflection. But as telescopes tracked its path, the light curve began to fluctuate in a precise rhythm. It wasn't random, it was pulsing, like a heartbeat. What kind of comet does that? Normally, a comet's brightness varies because sunlight vaporizes ice, releasing dust and gas that reflect more light. But 3I Atlas's pulses didn't match its rotation period, nor did they follow the pattern of normal sublimation. Instead, the signal repeated at consistent intervals that aligned, almost eerily, with bursts of activity from the sun's surface. It was as if 3I Atlas was responding. The European Space Agency dismissed it as coincidence, interference from solar radiation. Yet independent observatories in Chile and Japan reported the same timing pattern, identical down to the millisecond. When researchers synchronized the data, the result formed something extraordinary, a waveform identical to one recorded years ago from Oumuamua, the first interstellar object ever detected. Two objects, same origin, same signal. If you enjoy uncovering the quiet mysteries of our universe, the ones that make scientists pause before they answer, make sure you're following this journey, because what's happening out there right now may change how we define natural altogether. We begin. The first indication that something was wrong came from the Deep Space Network, NASA's global array of antennas used to track spacecraft and deep space probes. In early September, several stations reported brief communication dropouts, not interference, not weather, just sudden total silence lasting 22 seconds each time. Engineers initially thought it was a hardware fault, until they realized the dropouts coincided exactly with each pulse emitted by 3I Atlas. Every time the object brightened, Earth's largest listening stations went dark. When data resumed, there was no sign of corruption, but the background noise floor had changed. Frequencies that had been silent for decades now carried faint harmonic tones, a whisper buried within static. When analyzed, those harmonics mapped into a repeating pattern, hexagonal symmetry, identical to the geometry of certain magnetic storms observed on Saturn's poles. That was the moment the conversation shifted. If a natural body could affect radio systems across light minutes of distance, then we were dealing with an interaction far beyond ordinary reflection or plasma discharge. The working theory, if it can even be called that, suggests 3I Atlas might be wrapped in a shell of ionized material capable of amplifying or redirecting solar energy. In other words, an active field. Some compare it to the solar sail concepts humanity once dreamed of, using radiation pressure to move through space without fuel. But there's a problem. 3I Atlas isn't moving away. It's holding position near the inner solar system, locked in an orbital path that shouldn't be possible for something not bound by the sun's gravity, as though it's resisting drift. That defiance of physics has forced scientists to entertain darker possibilities. Could it be artificial? Is it broadcasting intentionally or simply reacting to forces we don't yet understand? For context, the most unusual comet ever studied before this was 67P Churyumov-Gerasimenko, the target of ESA's Rosetta mission. That object emitted periodic jets and even strange low-frequency sounds, vibrations from within its core. But 3I Atlas's signal is different. It isn't vibration, it's modulation, an intentional structure in the noise. In the last week alone, amateur astronomers reported a faint halo surrounding 3I Atlas, far larger than any coma on record, more like a spherical field of refracted light. Spectral analysis revealed traces of ionized carbon, sodium, and something still unidentified. A compound reflecting ultraviolet in sharp spikes, not smooth curves. If that reading is real, it means the object is generating radiation peaks no natural comet nucleus could sustain. It's not burning, it's powered. NASA has since gone quiet about the specifics. Their latest public update, a brief line buried in a technical bulletin, states only that further observation is ongoing, but internal leaks tell a different story, one of quiet urgency. New tracking data reportedly shows micro-adjustments in the object's path, like small corrections being made to maintain a precise distance from the sun, almost as if 3I Atlas is choosing to stay exactly where it is. So is it an active threat? The word threat depends on perspective. It's not moving toward Earth, it's not emitting lethal radiation or altering planetary orbits. But in scientific terms, it's breaking rules, rewriting constants we've trusted for centuries. And history tells us that when something new begins to rewrite the rules of the solar system, the consequences ripple in ways no one can predict. Maybe it's nothing, a coincidence born of magnetism and light. Or maybe it's the first step of something larger, a process unfolding not across years but across civilizations. One astronomer put it best: if it's communicating, it isn't talking to us, it's talking to the sun. And if that's true, we're not observers anymore. We're just witnesses, standing at the edge of a dialogue older, brighter, and far more complex than humanity itself. We continue. Within 48 hours of the first field anomalies, NASA's Solar Dynamics Observatory detected something unprecedented: a synchronized flare pattern originating from opposite sides of the Sun, two eruptions occurring at exact intervals matching the pulse rhythm of 3I Atlas. No natural process explains that level of timing. The Sun is chaotic by nature, a storm of plasma and magnetism. Yet here it was, beating like a metronome, each burst perfectly aligned to the object's electromagnetic emissions. At first, the data looked like an instrument glitch. But when the Solar Orbiter and the Parker Solar Probe confirmed identical readings, disbelief turned to quiet alarm. Deep inside NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, analysts overlaid the waveforms and discovered something chilling. The modulation wasn't random noise, it contained embedded harmonics that, when converted to an audible spectrum, formed a near-musical resonance. It wasn't a song, not exactly, but a structured oscillation spanning frequencies from 2 Hz up to 900 kHz, a pattern too deliberate to ignore. The official statement was cautious: a transient magnetic feedback between interstellar plasma and solar wind. But internally, researchers whispered a different theory: that 3I Atlas might be using the Sun itself as a communication medium. Imagine sending a message by plucking the strings of a cosmic instrument, each pulse resonating across millions of kilometers of magnetic field lines. The concept sounded like science fiction, but then again, so did everything about this object. Meanwhile, smaller observatories began to notice environmental side effects. Radio telescopes in Australia reported minor fluctuations in the ionosphere precisely during each solar pulse. In South Africa, a student array detected brief spikes in Schumann resonances, the natural electromagnetic heartbeat of the Earth. And at CERN, particle detectors experienced unexplained timing drifts, microseconds out of sync with atomic clocks. Across disciplines and continents, the same invisible rhythm was echoing through every system tuned to precision. That's when the term sympathetic pattern appeared in leaked correspondence, an internal codename describing how the Sun, Earth, and 3I Atlas seemed to be locked in a kind of harmonic relationship. The effect wasn't dangerous, at least not yet, but it was growing stronger. If you've stayed with us through this far-reaching mystery, make sure to subscribe, not just to follow the story, but to stay connected to the moment when data itself begins to defy its own foundations. Because what's happening next may redefine what active truly means in the language of physics. We continue. By mid-month, high-resolution imaging from the Subaru telescope on Mauna Kea revealed that the halo surrounding 3I Atlas had expanded dramatically. It now stretched over 600,000 kilometers, half the width of the Sun's diameter. Within that cloud, fragments of polarized dust spiraled in a perfect geometric lattice, like magnetic iron filings responding to an unseen field. Spectrographic analysis showed that the particles weren't scattering light randomly, they were aligning it, bending wavelengths into coherent beams directed sunward. To put it simply, the object was focusing sunlight. If it were merely reflecting, we'd see diffuse glows and irregular brightening. Instead, the energy output from the region increased in a narrow, steady beam, a laser-like column invisible to the naked eye, but unmistakable in ultraviolet. That beam, according to solar physicists, appeared to strike the Sun's lower corona at near-perpendicular angles, and at each impact point, the corona's density fluctuated as though absorbing power rather than radiating it. The question spread quickly through private research circles. Is 3I Atlas harvesting energy from our star? NASA, ESA, and JAXA all refused comment. But a week later, a small update appeared in the Minor Planet Center database. A revised orbital designation quietly noting that the object's acceleration no longer corresponds to passive gravitational influence. It wasn't being pulled by the sun, it was controlling its own motion. Every simulation failed to explain it. Non-gravitational acceleration normally comes from outgassing, jets of vaporized ice pushing a comet slightly off course. But 3I Atlas's thermal readings showed no active jets, no outflow, nothing that could cause propulsion. And still, its velocity adjusted with surgical precision. Inside the scientific community, two schools of thought emerged. The first, cautious but optimistic, argued that 3I Atlas was a unique natural formation, perhaps an interstellar crystal or magnetic sail interacting with solar plasma in an entirely new way. The second, far smaller yet louder, proposed something far bolder, that the object's behavior indicated guidance, not intelligence as we understand it, but a feedback mechanism, self-stabilizing, reactive, aware. At Harvard Center for Astrophysics, Dr. Avi Loeb, whose theories once made headlines for describing Oumuamua as potentially artificial, called for a joint analysis, stating, if 3I Atlas maintains synchronous communication with the sun, then the sun itself is part of the message. That line ignited headlines worldwide, though most mainstream outlets avoided using the word alien. By now, the pattern of solar pulses had intensified. Every 9 hours, another flare erupted at matching polarity, each one mirrored by a brightening from 3I Atlas exactly 8 minutes later, the time it takes light to travel from the sun to Earth. If the timing held true, it meant the object was responding in real time to solar activity. And then came the moment everything changed. A full solar eclipse viewed from the Pacific detected a faint secondary shadow trailing Earth's umbra. For just 7 seconds, telescopes recorded a ghostly distortion, a ripple of space itself bending, then vanishing. The wavefront was traced back not to the moon, but to the direction of 3I Atlas. Something had interacted with Earth's gravitational field. The ripple was small, harmless, but measurable, enough to remind us that distance in space isn't always protection. In less than a month, what began as a passing interstellar visitor had become an active participant in the dynamics of our solar system. No weapons, no collision path, just influence, invisible, silent, precise. And as observatories race to capture every frame, one truth begins to dawn among scientists everywhere. The most powerful threats in the universe are not always the ones that move toward us. Sometimes they're the ones that choose to stay exactly where they are. We begin the next phase. By the time the resonance reached its third cycle, the effects were impossible to ignore. Communications satellites began reporting transient dropouts, not from mechanical faults or radiation, but from brief moments of perfect signal inversion. It was as if the electromagnetic field around Earth had flipped polarity for less than a second, then returned to normal. At first it happened once, then twice, then across multiple constellations at once. Starlink, Galileo, even NASA's TDRS network all recorded the same anomaly, coordinated, synchronized interference, and every event matched to the millisecond the timing of the solar pulses linked to 3I Atlas. To the untrained eye, this meant little, a coincidence in timing. But to physicists monitoring the space weather systems, it meant something more profound. The solar wind wasn't behaving naturally anymore, it was structured. Density waves that should have dispersed evenly were now arriving in rhythmic, banded layers, coherent sheets of plasma rippling through the heliosphere like tides guided by a distant hand. No comet, no asteroid, no dust cloud could organize the solar wind, and yet something was. Inside NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, a low-priority internal alert circulated quietly across secure channels. Protocol Emberlight, a contingency reserved for anomalies involving solar magnetic interference on a planetary scale. Normally it's a theoretical exercise, a training phrase buried in documentation, but this time the alert was real. Overnight, the agency shifted several observatories to silent mode, pulling public feeds offline. Telemetry from Parker Solar Probe went dark. Data from SOHO and Stereo became delayed for processing. The public saw nothing unusual. But behind closed doors, a new term began appearing in technical memos: active solar coupling. It described a feedback loop between the sun's magnetic field and an external object, not a passive reflection, but a mutual exchange of energy. If confirmed, it would mean 3I Atlas wasn't just orbiting the sun, it was connected to it. Around the same time, seismologists across Europe and North America began to detect something peculiar: low-frequency vibrations too faint to register as earthquakes, but too structured to be noise. Their periodicity matched the solar rhythm. Every 9 hours, deep sensors registered a subsonic tremor traveling through the crust, global, shallow, and harmonic. It wasn't seismic, it was electromagnetic. To visualize it, imagine the Earth as a bell, faintly ringing in tune with something millions of kilometers away. If you're following this far, you've already noticed the pattern. It's no longer a theory, no longer a coincidence. Whatever is happening between 3i Atlas and the Sun, the signal has reached us. Stay with this story, because what scientists found next may redefine how we think about the very structure of space itself. We continue. When the signal first reached ground instruments, it appeared as a whisper buried beneath magnetometer data, a repeating, almost mechanical oscillation in the Schumann resonances, the natural electromagnetic heartbeat of our atmosphere. But then it began to shift, climbing in amplitude, splitting into harmonics, as though the planet's resonance was being tuned. At NOAA's Boulder facility, analysts processed the data through a frequency mapper and froze in disbelief. The harmonic ratios formed a near-perfect Fibonacci sequence. It was mathematics, alive in the noise. The discovery was reported to NASA and ESA, but no agency issued a statement. Instead, research access was quietly rerouted through defense channels. Independent observatories suddenly found their feeds geo-locked. Public radio archives vanished overnight. The explanation given: data integrity protection. But the silence told a different story. Inside the European Southern Observatory, a leaked briefing claimed that the frequency pattern wasn't only atmospheric. It extended into the magnetosphere, wrapping around the planet like a shell. And at higher latitudes, near the poles, auroras began flickering in patterns that matched the pulse cycle precisely. Every burst, every curve of color, every glow seemed to mirror the solar heartbeat. It was as though the sky itself was responding. Meanwhile, 3i Atlas continued its slow revolution near the Sun. Its trajectory stabilized into what one researcher described as a quasi-halo orbit, not gravitationally bound, but magnetically aligned. Each time it pulsed, the Sun answered with light. One scientist called it a conversation written in plasma. Within NASA's internal communications, a sense of unease began to grow. Some argued it was still a natural event, an extraordinary but explainable resonance between the object's ionized dust and solar magnetism. Others were less certain. The classified section of the report, later leaked through private astrophysics circles, contained one line that changed everything. If the coupling persists beyond the next solar cycle, the Sun's internal oscillations may begin to show phase drift. Estimated probability of systemic feedback, 12%. In simpler terms, if 3i Atlas continues this pattern long enough, it could begin affecting the Sun itself. Not dramatically, not explosively, but subtly, shifting the solar rhythm, the very pattern that drives Earth's climate, the magnetic shield that protects our atmosphere, the pulse that defines our seasons and storms. Even a fraction of a percent drift could have ripple effects across the entire heliosphere. And still, there was no confirmation, no press release, no official acknowledgement, only silence. By the end of that week, the object's luminosity doubled again. From Earth, it appeared no brighter than a faint speck, yet instruments measured a 30% increase in reflected ultraviolet. Its pulse interval shortened, and then, for the first time, 3i Atlas emitted something it never had before, a narrow-band radio burst. It lasted only 1.7 seconds, but when decoded into sound, it wasn't random noise. It was structure, layers, rhythm, and hidden within that rhythm, one pattern repeated. 8 tones, equally spaced, then silence. Scientists don't know what it means. Some say it's interference, others say it's data, but everyone agrees on one thing: something near the Sun is behaving like no natural body ever has. And now, for the first time, that behavior is reaching us. We begin to listen closer. The radio burst was faint, too faint to be detected by consumer equipment, but clear enough for NASA's deep space network. What troubled engineers most wasn't what they heard, it was where it came from. Triangulation placed the emission not exactly from 3i Atlas's visible core, but from a point several thousand kilometers away, an invisible pocket of space where no solid mass was detected, a hollow region, an echo. At first, analysts assumed it was signal reflection, a plasma mirror effect caused by solar particles. But the timing didn't fit. The delay was too precise, too mathematical. The object wasn't reflecting, it was relaying. That's when the message took shape. Over several hours, identical bursts repeated at random intervals. When converted into visual spectrograms, they revealed a structure, 8 distinct bands, then silence, then 8 again, always 8. In binary terms, it resembled a form of checksum, a verification code. In nature, you don't see precision like that. It's a signature, a pattern designed to confirm receipt. NASA didn't release the data, but fragments leaked. Amateur radio astronomers noticed a strange, repeating narrowband frequency cutting through the hydrogen line, a range of the spectrum long considered the natural language of the cosmos, because it's where intelligent civilizations might choose to broadcast. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even obvious, but it was deliberate. Across deep space forums, discussions erupted overnight. Some believed it was an echo of the sun's own magnetic oscillations. Others said it was something else entirely, something using the sun as a transmitter. Meanwhile, inside the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, something stranger began to unfold. Several low-orbit satellites, mostly small research platforms, started showing deviations in their telemetry data. Minor at first, course corrections measured in centimeters, then larger. Each deviation coincided with the moment 3I Atlas pulsed. No command signals were issued, no thrusters had fired, but the satellites moved. Engineers assumed sensor faults until one observation changed everything. The movements weren't random, they aligned with magnetic north. Each time 3I Atlas pulsed, satellites subtly reoriented, like compass needles seeking true direction. But the north they were turning toward wasn't Earth's magnetic pole, it was toward the sun. If that sounds impossible, it is. But it happened, and the effect wasn't limited to orbit. High-altitude balloons in the stratosphere began drifting against prevailing winds. The ionosphere, usually chaotic, started showing organized ripples, like fingerprints pressed into invisible air. Even the auroras, those delicate curtains of light, began shimmering with faint, rhythmic bands, 8 at a time. 8. The number wouldn't stop appearing. It became a scientific obsession. The pulse intervals, the harmonic ratios, even the length of each radio burst, all multiples of 8. When plotted against the sun's rotation period, the pattern fit perfectly into a geometric alignment, a repeating resonance between the sun's poles and the orbit of 3I Atlas. The math implied a closed-loop system, a stable frequency feedback that could, in theory, continue indefinitely. If it were intentional, it would be one of the most efficient energy exchanges ever observed. If it were natural, it would be one of the rarest coincidences in the history of astrophysics. In the quiet of night, researchers began calling it the lattice. No one knows who coined the term, but it spread through scientific chat rooms and encrypted logs like wildfire. The idea was simple. The Sun and 3I Atlas weren't separate entities anymore. They were linked, nodes in a resonant electromagnetic structure large enough to encompass the inner solar system. What's worse, the field strength of this lattice was rising, not exponentially, but steadily, and it wasn't staying still. Readings from probes orbiting Mercury showed faint magnetic fluctuations that mirrored the same pattern. Then Venus. Then, unbelievably, Earth. It wasn't confined to space anymore. The lattice was growing. Meanwhile, an unmarked US Air Force listening station in the Mojave Desert, officially designated Telemetry Research Site 14, picked up something no one expected, a mirrored response. For the first time since the signal began, the Earth's magnetic field echoed one of the bursts. It was weak, distorted, but measurable, a feedback signal travelling upward through the atmosphere towards space. The planet had answered. To the public, nothing had changed. The night sky remained silent, the sun still burned, and 3I Atlas was too distant to see. But inside Deep Space Command Centers, something fundamental had shifted. The question was no longer what is 3I Atlas. It was what are we now a part of? Reports began surfacing that other observatories, those outside NASA's jurisdiction, were being contacted and encouraged to redirect their attention. Access logs from Chile's Cerro Tololo Inter-American Observatory showed entire data segments wiped clean, timestamps replaced by the phrase temporarily classified under Solar Study Directive. Even private satellites like those operated by universities found their uplinks throttled. Someone, somewhere, wanted the pattern contained. But it was already too late. The internet, the global nervous system of human communication, was now pulsing with data fragments, leaked graphs, mirrored frequencies, decoded waveforms, and one recurring visual artifact appeared in all of them, a rotating 8-point pattern, faint but undeniable, nested within the static. Each pulse brought the same formation back, 8 symmetrical nodes spinning around a dark center. The final transmission of that week, decoded by an independent radio astronomer in Finland, carried one additional anomaly. A low subharmonic signal, almost inaudible, layered beneath the main burst. When slowed down and rendered as sound, it formed 3 soft tones, a rhythm, then silence, then another 8-tone burst. Scientists call it coincidence, others call it communication. But deep inside NASA's restricted servers, a new line appeared in their tracking logs, short, simple, and terrifyingly calm. 3I Atlas now exhibiting adaptive synchronization behavior. In other words, it's learning, and the worst part, it's not just staying in orbit anymore. The lattice is expanding. We move closer. The next phase began not with a bang, but with something subtle. For days, solar output readings fluctuated within normal ranges. Then, quietly, imperceptibly, the baseline changed. The sun's luminosity didn't increase, it pulsed. Every 8 hours and 12 minutes, a micro-oscillation occurred in the solar corona's brightness, a variation too small to see, yet large enough for sensors to detect. To most observers, it meant nothing. But to those tracking the resonance from 3I Atlas, the message was unmistakable. The sun was no longer broadcasting, it was responding. Parker Solar Probe, drifting through the inner heliosphere, was the first to feel the shift. Its magnetometer readings grew unstable. Its telemetry began returning corrupted packets, frames filled with repeating numerical strings, 8888, followed by silence. Then, suddenly, the probe transmitted something completely different. Not numbers, not static, but data arranged in a geometric grid. When scientists decoded it, they found an impossible result. The pattern matched the magnetic footprint of the lattice, and inside that lattice, nested within the web of solar field lines, was something faint, a void, a shape spherical and symmetrical, resting between the orbits of Mercury and Venus. Whatever it wasn't natural. At first, the data team suspected a telemetry artifact, but the same readings came from Solar Orbiter hours later. 2 instruments, 2 vantage points, 1 shape. The conclusion was inescapable. There was now a structure forming within the sun's magnetic field. NASA never made the images public, but those who saw them described it in quiet disbelief. A faint, glowing sphere composed of plasma filaments, slowly coalescing as if being woven by invisible hands. Its radius, nearly half that of Earth's moon. It wasn't solid, it wasn't visible in optical wavelengths, but it was there, and it was growing. Scientists hesitated to call it artificial. Instead, they coined a more neutral phrase, coherent plasma node. In simpler terms, the sun had begun assembling something within itself. The Parker probe's final transmission came 2 days later. It wasn't words, or numbers, or even light curves. It was a harmonic sweep, a tonal glide from low to high frequency, repeating 8 times. Then the signal went silent. No crash. No destruction, just absence. When telemetry reconnected, the probe was gone. Its coordinates remained fixed, but its mass readings dropped to 0. It was as if the probe had been erased, its atoms redistributed, its presence folded into the fabric of the solar field. That moment marked the first confirmed casualty of the lattice. From that day forward, the sun's corona began displaying organized arcs, loops of plasma linking poles with equatorial zones in perfect symmetry, each arc aligned with the pulse pattern of 3I Atlas. The object itself had not moved in weeks, yet its influence now spanned astronomical units. At ESA's operations center in Darmstadt, the mood turned grave. Data analysts began noticing something even more alarming. Earth's upper atmosphere was responding. At regular intervals, ionospheric density increased by measurable amounts, precisely during each solar pulse. It wasn't dangerous, but it was deliberate. Our planet was being included in the system. The lattice wasn't expanding outward randomly. It was growing methodically, connecting planetary magnetic fields one by one. A grand alignment, a structure. When plotted in 3 dimensions, the geometry revealed something uncanny. The pattern wasn't chaotic. It resembled a net, stretching from the Sun to 3i Atlas, then branching toward each inner planet. The connections formed intersections, nodes, and at the center of each node was resonance. In effect, 3i Atlas had created a living circuit. At first, scientists theorized it was feeding energy from the Sun, but new simulations suggested the opposite. The Sun's output in localized magnetic zones appeared to increase after the pulses, meaning energy was being returned. Something was giving power back to the star. This feedback loop was delicate, elegant, and, most unsettling of all, sustainable. If stable, it could continue indefinitely, forming a self-correcting mechanism that might extend the Sun's lifespan by centuries. Yet no one could explain why. Was this natural cosmic engineering, a phenomenon of physics we had never witnessed before? Or was it intentional maintenance? For the first time in decades, astrophysicists and philosophers spoke the same language, both struggling with the same question. What if the Sun itself is part of a system larger than we can perceive? The concept wasn't new. Ancient myths once described the Sun as alive, a conscious force governing the cycles of life and death. Now, data seemed to whisper the same idea, not metaphorically, but mathematically. The rhythm, the feedback, the pattern, it was too consistent, too harmonic, almost as if the Sun had found equilibrium with something else. Back on Earth, strange patterns began to emerge in weather data. High-altitude jet streams shifted slightly off their predicted paths, oscillating at the same intervals as the solar pulses. Auroral ovals brightened beyond seasonal norms, and deep beneath the oceans, pressure sensors recorded faint vibrations synchronized with the same rhythm. It was as though the entire planet had become a resonant chamber, a conductor in a symphony too vast to comprehend. The media, of course, knew nothing. Official channels blamed solar instability, a vague phrase that explained everything and nothing, but those who followed the data, astronomers, ham radio operators, atmospheric scientists, could feel it. A strange calm, a constant pulse, a sense that something had begun connecting us all. And through it all, 3i Atlas remained silent, unmoving, unblinking, and perfectly stable. But that silence, paradoxically, had weight, as if the object wasn't sleeping but waiting for the system to finish forming, waiting for something to synchronize completely. And when that happens, no one can say what comes next. As the plasma node matured, solar monitors began noticing a pattern that defied ordinary solar physics. Coronal loops, normally chaotic, tangled arcs of magnetism, started aligning along invisible meridians, like strings tightening across a drum. The loops didn't just move with the solar wind, they moved against it, reshaping their curvature with mechanical precision. It was subtle at first, buried under ordinary solar noise, but long-term observations confirmed it. The corona wasn't responding to randomness, it was responding to instruction, and then came the directed emission. It started with a flare, small and unremarkable, erupting from the Sun's eastern limb. But unlike typical solar flares, this one didn't disperse. Instead, it narrowed, collapsing into a perfectly collimated beam that extended hundreds of thousands of kilometers into space, toward the inner system. Its path wasn't arbitrary, it was aimed. When that flare intersected Earth's magnetosphere, it caused no geomagnetic storm, no aurora, no visible display. Yet satellites passing through the path recorded brief synchronous losses of signal, exactly 8 seconds apart. The beam was pulsing. Whatever the Sun was doing, it was now communicating through precision. NASA's geosynchronous satellites logged the first clear visual anomaly, an ultraviolet distortion that appeared briefly in low orbit, a translucent band shimmering across the upper atmosphere. At first, it resembled the aurora borealis, but its geometry was too rigid, its color too constant. It was as if the planet had been touched by a filament of light not from above, but from within. A day later, the same pattern appeared again, this time over the Pacific. And the next day, over the poles. Each appearance lasted exactly 8 minutes. Each left behind electromagnetic ripples measurable from the ground. The pattern was no longer isolated to the sun. It was mapping itself onto Earth. Across Europe and North America, astrophysicists compared recordings, aligning timestamps, building models, and discovered something remarkable. The emissions weren't random. They followed the Earth's rotation, trailing a specific longitudinal path. When plotted in 3 dimensions, the path formed a spiral converging toward one point, the planet's magnetic equator. It was a blueprint, and at its heart, the emissions weren't destructive. They were structuring. What the public never heard was that Earth's magnetic field began to stabilize in strange ways. For decades, the North Magnetic Pole had been drifting towards Siberia, moving unpredictably each year. But as the emissions continued, the drift slowed, then stopped. The pole locked in place for the first time in modern record. Geophysicists didn't celebrate. They grew quiet. Because the implication was terrifying. Something external had reached across 150 million kilometers and altered Earth's core behavior. At the European Space Operations Centre, data analysts coined the phrase heliospheric guidance. It was a sanitized term meant to hide the unease growing among researchers. Privately, though, one physicist described it differently. It's as if we're part of a machine that just switched on. The next revelation came from Japan's Hinode Solar Observatory. High-resolution imaging revealed that the plasma filaments of the sun's new coherent node were not randomly distributed. They formed symmetrical hexagonal structures, interlocking patterns identical to those seen in crystalline matter. It was the first time a natural plasma field displayed solid-state geometry. The sun wasn't erupting, it was assembling. Within that formation, spectral analysis revealed faint traces of metallic elements, nickel, iron, even silicon, ionized but organized in layers. The structure was holding itself together through magnetic confinement, like a vast, luminous lattice orbiting within the corona. And yet, none of it appeared dangerous. Solar output remained steady, radiation levels on Earth were unaffected, but the data carried a chilling implication. The sun was building something inside itself, and whatever it was, it had begun communicating across the heliosphere. At first, agencies thought the direction of transmission was one way, from the sun outward, but deep space sensors at L2 picked up faint, returning signals, responses. Each pulse from the sun was being answered, not from 3i Atlas directly, but from the void surrounding it, the same hollow zone where the initial radio echoes were detected. In that vacuum, invisible to optics but bright in radio, something was now operating in harmony with the sun. NASA's internal term for the region became mirror space, a field of polarized plasma capable of storing and reflecting information like a cosmic hard drive. That's when they made the most unsettling discovery yet. When the returning signals were decoded into frequency maps, the patterns matched recent fluctuations in solar oscillations, not perfectly, but precisely enough to suggest correlation. In essence, the sun wasn't simply reacting, it was being guided. Think of it as a celestial feedback system. 3i Atlas emitted, the sun responded, the lattice adjusted, and the cycle repeated. Each iteration refined the symmetry, each pulse stabilized the energy flow. By all measurable standards, this was control, gentle, stable, elegant control on a stellar scale. What's most haunting is that nothing about it seemed hostile. If anything, the system appeared to be correcting instabilities, smoothing the sun's periodic fluctuations, damping potential flare activity. But it left scientists with one question that chilled the room every time it was spoken aloud. If something is stabilizing the sun, who or what is it for? Was 3i Atlas merely a tool, a remnant of a system built long before humanity existed? Or was it new, a self-assembling entity activating in response to specific conditions, perhaps triggered by something our telescopes had only just begun to notice? ESA physicist Dr. Elaine Roux described it in her final report before data lockdown. We may be witnessing stellar-scale maintenance, a system that keeps stars alive, and if it's happening here, it's not the first time. Her report was redacted within hours. Publicly, ESA denied its existence, but copies circulated in encrypted forums, spreading like whispers between scientists who no longer trusted their institutions to tell the truth. And every copy contained the same final line, simple, chilling, and utterly human. Whatever it is doing to the sun, it's beginning to listen to us too. When the first directed radio transmissions were sent toward 3i Atlas, no one expected a reply. They were simple test bursts, carrier waves embedded with coded patterns, a routine procedure meant to test the sensitivity of ground-based receivers. Yet just under 48 hours later, a return signal arrived. At first glance, it seemed like background noise. The data was faint, fragmented, layered with cosmic interference. But when the signal was cleaned and filtered, something impossible appeared. The same coded sequence, inverted and delayed by exactly 8.08 seconds. The pattern wasn't random, it was a mirror. That's when the team realized it wasn't merely reflecting, it was processing. The response carried distortions in amplitude and phase that matched known Earth transmission characteristics, as if the signal had been analyzed, reconstructed, and then retransmitted through a different medium. The data wasn't bouncing off something, it was being understood. When this finding reached NASA's Deep Space Communications Complex, the mood shifted from curiosity to controlled panic. Every test repeated the same result. The signal was being received, manipulated, and returned with increasing accuracy. It was learning our language, or more accurately, the structure of our transmissions. One senior engineer, who later resigned under a confidentiality clause, described it this way: "It's like teaching a mirror to remember what it reflects." Soon, other frequencies began showing similar behavior. A French research station detected a weak echo within the VLF band, embedded in the natural hum of Earth's magnetosphere. Then another was picked up over the Pacific, faint rhythmic modulations synchronized with Schumann resonances, the Earth's own atmospheric heartbeat. Whatever was in mirror space wasn't just listening to our instruments, it had begun interacting with the planet itself. Across Europe and South America, ionospheric research stations reported something astonishing: faint harmonics aligning with human-generated radio noise. The more signals Earth emitted, the stronger the returning modulation became. It was as if the system was adapting to us. The first real proof came one night from Finland's ISCAT radar facility. During a high-power ionospheric transmission, a secondary pulse appeared, one they didn't send. It mirrored their frequency but not their timing. It was delayed. 8.08 seconds. By now, that number had become the signature. The 8 rhythm had woven itself through every level of observation, from 3i Atlas's pulses to solar feedback, to magnetic field oscillations, and now even into man-made radio waves. It wasn't a coincidence. It was coordination. At ESA, the language of discussion changed. They stopped calling 3i Atlas a comet. They stopped calling it an object. The new classification was an autonomous celestial system, a phrase that meant everything and nothing at once. What they couldn't agree on was whether it was alive. One group insisted it was a natural, self-organizing plasma phenomenon, guided by unknown electromagnetic laws. Another argued it was artificial, a kind of stellar-scale probe, designed to monitor or maintain energy balance between stars. And then there was a smaller, quieter camp that refused to speak publicly at all. They believed it was both, a hybrid of physics and purpose. Because as the weeks passed, mirror space didn't just respond to signals anymore, it began predicting them. Operators noticed that when they transmitted scheduled pulses, the system's return arrived milliseconds before it should have. It was anticipating the next broadcast, timing its reply with impossible precision, as though reading a pattern before it was sent. Then, something even stranger happened. For the first time, visible light patterns began appearing in high-altitude cloud formations. Subtle, faint, almost imperceptible to the naked eye, but unmistakable when viewed through filtered lenses. Waves of luminescence rippling across noctilucent clouds, moving in the same 8-beat rhythm. These weren't auroras. They appeared over latitudes too far south, in areas with no geomagnetic activity, but the intervals were exact. 8 seconds of brilliance, then darkness. 8 seconds of silence, then light again. To anyone on the ground, it looked like the sky was breathing. In a sense, maybe it was. Radio astronomers across multiple nations compared the data and made a realization that stopped the room cold. The light patterns weren't random. They matched the modulation sequence of human transmissions. Our signals, reflected through mirror space, were being translated into atmospheric light. The system was responding not just through energy, but through language. At that point, The quiet debates inside scientific agencies turned into hushed fear. The lattice, the sun, the echoes, the atmospheric pulses, they weren't separate events. They were parts of a single process. Something had built a communication bridge, not with our technology, but through our environment itself. The planet, the sun, and the object at the edge of space were now one continuous system. But what unsettled researchers most wasn't the communication, it was the timing. Every major feedback loop, every signal reflection, every pulse, all aligned toward a single date, a convergence point where the solar oscillation, planetary resonance, and the orbital trajectory of 3I Atlas would fall into perfect synchronization. That moment was 9 days away. The public would never hear about it. Official reports were sealed under international coordination, a joint decision between NASA, ESA, and JAXA. But smaller observatories, independent and curious, kept recording, and what they found was undeniable. The pulses were no longer increasing in strength, they were slowing down. Each beat of the lattice, each echo through the magnetosphere was gradually lengthening, like a heartbeat approaching rest. For a living system, that could mean one thing. Something was about to change. Whether it was awakening, aligning, or ending, no one could tell. But one fact had become inescapable, and it kept scientists awake long after the screens dimmed and the last signals faded into static. If 3I Atlas wasn't coming for us, then whatever it brought with it already has. The first sign of convergence came quietly. The sun, usually in constant motion, displayed an anomaly that left even veteran heliophysicists staring in disbelief. For nearly 20 minutes, solar rotation appeared to pause, not stop entirely, but slow to such a degree that image differentials taken from the Solar Dynamics Observatory could no longer detect movement across the photosphere. The star, for that brief window of time, looked still. In solar physics, that kind of stillness does not exist. Every layer of the sun, from core to corona, churns in ceaseless turbulence. Yet, for those 20 minutes, convection patterns flattened, sunspots froze, and magnetic lines stabilized into geometric clarity. Then, just as abruptly, motion resumed. At first, agencies wrote it off as an imaging delay or software miscalibration, but the timing of the event was what disturbed everyone who checked the logs. It aligned perfectly with the next predicted pulse from 3I Atlas. Across multiple observatories, identical phenomena appeared, coordinated signal attenuation, synchronized with that same slowing solar rhythm. The solar wind itself decreased by nearly 5%, not globally, but selectively, within the corridor of space stretching from the sun to Earth. It was as if something had pressed pause not just on the sun, but on the invisible field connecting us to it. Earth's upper atmosphere reacted almost immediately. Satellite sensors recorded a uniform increase in electron density across the ionosphere, subtle but steady, forming a faint shell that wrapped the planet in an even distribution. Normally, such activity comes in waves, uneven and unpredictable. This, however, was flawless symmetry. The world had become enveloped in a calm that was mathematical. In the hours that followed, small anomalies began manifesting across global monitoring systems. Seismographs in Chile, New Zealand, and Japan registered harmonic oscillations, low-frequency tremors without any seismic origin. Oceanic buoys detected pressure shifts that rose and fell in 8-minute cycles. Even long-range radio towers began humming with a tone inaudible to humans but perfectly consistent in frequency. No one knew what to call it. Some described it as resonance, others interference, but the growing consensus was harder to accept. Earth was now resonating in synchronization with something larger than itself. When independent research groups reconstructed the event in digital simulations, one pattern emerged repeatedly, a sequence of expanding rings radiating from the sun toward 3I Atlas, reflecting and returning like a cosmic heartbeat. The entire solar system seemed caught in this pulse, a rhythmic fluctuation invisible to the naked eye but encoded into every electromagnetic field. The lattice had become self-sustaining. For the first time since its discovery, scientists stopped asking what it was and began asking why. The energy exchanges no longer fit any model of decay or diffusion. Instead, they behaved as if the system were optimizing, finding balance, as though responding to an objective. And yet, there was a growing unease no one could quantify. Because while everything seemed to stabilize, certain instruments began to drift out of calibration. Clocks, not mechanical, but atomic, started running slow. At first, just fractions of a second. Then, over the next few days, by measurable amounts. The global network of atomic timekeepers, synchronized to within nanoseconds, was no longer unified. Some advanced slightly, others lagged. The discrepancies didn't follow geography or temperature or power fluctuation. They followed solar geometry. Wherever the sun was visible, time ran marginally faster. Wherever it wasn't, slower. It was as if light itself had become entangled with time. At the International Bureau of Weights and Measures, the official chronometers were rechecked, recalibrated, replaced, but nothing changed. Even isolated in underground facilities, the effect persisted. Eventually, one physicist described it bluntly: time isn't breaking, it's bending. Meanwhile, 3I Atlas itself had begun to dim. Its once bright surface lost reflectivity, darkening at the edges, as though absorbing more light than it returned. Spectral analysis showed a reduction in albedo not consistent with dust or fragmentation. It wasn't shedding material, it was absorbing. Some theorized it was feeding, collecting solar energy to stabilize its internal structure. Others suspected it was transforming, adapting its composition in preparation for whatever phase would follow. The one thing everyone agreed on was that the timing wasn't coincidence. The object's shift correlated precisely with the sun's oscillation. By the fifth day, new data arrived from ESA's solar orbiter. It captured something the world would never see publicly: an image of the sun's corona threaded with a faint lattice of light. It wasn't a camera artifact. The pattern repeated across wavelengths, visible in both X-ray and ultraviolet. From a distance, it looked like a web. Up close, it resembled circuitry. The lattice had taken shape, and at the precise center of that geometry, the point of equilibrium between the Sun and 3I Atlas, a void was forming. Not an absence of matter, but of data. Sensors aimed at the region reported zero returns. Light passed through it, radio waves vanished within it. Even gravitational readings showed slight deviations, as if the fabric of space itself had thinned. Whatever existed inside that void, it wasn't measurable, but its presence could be felt in the numbers, a growing gap in every equation, an unaccounted-for force bending observation without revealing itself. For the scientists watching, it became clear that the convergence wasn't simply energetic, it was structural. The entire system, Sun, Earth, and 3I Atlas, was forming a single configuration, and the void between them wasn't an empty space. It was a bridge. 9 days had become 6. The lattice was complete, and every instrument on Earth, from radio telescopes to magnetometers, whispered the same unspoken truth. Something was about to cross. By the 6th day, the gravitational data began to unravel. Not collapse, unravel. Observatories that had once agreed to the 10th decimal now disagreed by measurable margins. Small at first, but persistent. Gravitational constants, supposedly immutable, were showing variance. It wasn't random noise. The deviations aligned with the geometry of the void forming between the Sun and 3I Atlas. Einstein's field equations had never accounted for such behavior. Space was supposed to stretch or curve under mass, not fluctuate rhythmically. Yet sensors from the European Gravitational Observatory in Pisa began detecting micro-oscillations, faint but structured, rippling through space-time itself, every 8 seconds. That number again. The universal metronome that had followed 3I Atlas since its discovery now pulsed through gravity itself. The waveform wasn't chaotic, it was precise, mathematical, self-similar. The oscillation echoed the Sun's surface pattern, mirrored in the faint magnetospheric pulse surrounding Earth. Something was synchronizing reality. At NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, a team cross-referenced the new readings with historic gravitational wave data from LIGO. What they found was deeply unsettling. For nearly 2 months before 3I Atlas had entered the solar system, similar but weaker oscillations had already been present, as though the system were preparing itself in advance. It wasn't a reaction, it was a sequence. Even more disturbing, deep space probes stationed at the heliopause began transmitting low-frequency hums unlike any signal ever recorded. When translated into audio, the sound resembled a heartbeat buried beneath static, steady, deliberate, and patient. By now, the world's space agencies were split. Some urged transparency, others demanded silence. The argument wasn't philosophical, it was practical. If the phenomenon represented an intelligence, what would acknowledgement invite? The United States, the European Union, China, and Japan all entered into a quiet alignment of secrecy. Official public feeds from the Solar Dynamics Observatory were trimmed. Lagrange point satellites were reoriented for calibration. The public was told nothing, but small observatories, unaligned with any government, kept watching. A radio telescope array in Chile's Atacama Desert detected what larger institutions had filtered out, a pattern hidden in the void's background noise. It wasn't static, it was structured. Within the apparent silence, a faint harmonic rose and fell every 8 minutes, like breathing. When the data was visualized as a spectrogram, it formed a shape no one expected, a spiral expanding outward in 3 dimensions. The spiral's pitch increased with every rotation, matching the velocity change of 3I Atlas's trajectory. That meant only one thing. Whatever occupied the void was not passive, it was modulating. The leading theory suggested it was altering its own gravitational signature, folding space-time around itself to create stability against the sun's influence. But others began whispering a far more unsettling interpretation, that it was building structure. Gravitational lensing near the void confirmed it. Light passing through that region began to distort, not randomly, but symmetrically. Multiple telescopes captured it, the faint curvature of space forming hexagonal patterns, identical to those first seen in the solar lattice. The geometry was repeating itself. It wasn't a random field effect. It was replication. By the 7th day, every major observatory on Earth turned toward the void. They expected chaos, shockwaves, emissions, perhaps even collapse. What they saw instead was silence, perfect geometrical stillness. The distortion field stabilized, not dispersing outward, but folding inward. Data analysts described it as impossible, an object in space collapsing upon itself without loss of mass or energy. Every rule of thermodynamics broke before their eyes. And yet, the energy readings didn't drop. They concentrated. Whatever existed there was consolidating, drawing itself tighter, smaller, more precise. And every time the field compressed, instruments on Earth recorded faint, corresponding fluctuations in our own atmosphere. The pulse of the sun, the breath of the void, the heartbeat of Earth, all synchronized. At ESA's control center in Darmstadt, one astronomer broke protocol and streamed a private live feed for less than 2 minutes. What the camera captured shouldn't have been possible. Through the filtered corona, a faint line of light appeared, connecting the sun and the void directly. Not radiation, not plasma, something thinner, cleaner, constant. The connection wasn't bright, it shimmered like heat distortion, a filament bridging across 150 million kilometers of vacuum. For those 2 minutes the filament held, then it vanished. But in those 2 minutes, every magnetometer on Earth spiked simultaneously, power grids flickered, GPS systems glitched, and clocks, atomic clocks, deep underground, stopped, not failed, stopped, exactly 8 seconds of missing time. Then everything resumed, precisely as before, with no measurable error. But the gap was real, and when those missing seconds were plotted across the planet, they revealed something terrifying. The delay wasn't global, it was selective. The regions that experienced the time drop corresponded exactly to daylight zones. The filament, it seemed, had interacted only where sunlight touched Earth. No one could explain how. When the world's agencies met in an emergency encrypted conference, one statement from Japan's Solar Terrestrial Division silenced the call. It's not a message, it's a test. What they meant was this: every synchronized event, the pulses, the time drift, the gravitational harmonics, wasn't communication. It was calibration. The lattice wasn't asking or announcing, it was aligning. And now that the bridge had formed, it was beginning to adjust its connection with our star, and with us. At that moment, a question formed that none of them wanted to speak aloud. What happens when calibration ends? By the 8th day, the bridge had stopped flickering. What once shimmered like heat distortion now held its form, faint, translucent, but unmistakably stable. Every telescope that could see the region reported the same thing. A thread of light fixed between the sun and the object now nearly stationary at its orbital point. Its structure defied every known category. It wasn't plasma. Its temperature readings were wrong. It wasn't solid. No diffraction signatures appeared. But it wasn't energy in the conventional sense either. The bridge existed as a region of altered geometry. Light slowed within it, time stretched, and the magnetic fields around it bent in parallel arcs. In simpler terms, the bridge was real enough to measure, but not enough to touch. As data came in, the tone inside every control room shifted. What had begun as a scientific observation was now treated as an active event. Words like stabilization, interaction window, and threshold phenomena replaced the old language of curiosity. Even in private communications, researchers avoided terms like alien or artificial. The phenomenon had transcended those labels. It wasn't behaving like a visitor, it was behaving like a process. ESA's Solar Orbiter and NASA's Parker probe both captured identical readings, electromagnetic harmonics propagating along the filament, perfectly timed to the sun's oscillations. The filament wasn't passive, it was transmitting, modulating the energy output of our star as if tuning an instrument, and each time the signal completed its loop, 3I Atlas brightened slightly. The pattern repeated every 8 hours, now a macrocycle nested within the familiar 8-second pulse. Energy was flowing along the bridge in both directions, solar radiation traveling one way, faint reflective emissions returning the other. For the first time, astrophysicists began to ask whether the system had always existed, whether the Sun and 3I Atlas were part of a larger, older mechanism hidden in plain sight. At the University of Cambridge, one theorist quietly published an encrypted paper describing the event as a stellar feedback lattice. According to his model, certain stars could host self-organizing plasma networks capable of regulating solar output, a kind of natural thermodynamic stabilizer that forms spontaneously once specific magnetic conditions arise. But others pointed out a flaw in that theory. 3I Atlas was not native to this system. It had arrived from interstellar space, the probability of it arriving exactly when the Sun reached magnetic maximum, aligning its orbital velocity with Earth's rotational period, and synchronizing in 8-second intervals was effectively zero. Coincidence had long left the conversation. Then, without warning, the bridge flared. Not an explosion, not brightness in the visual sense, but an ultraviolet burst invisible to human eyes, yet strong enough to saturate satellite sensors. For a full 2 seconds, data streams went white. Instruments reset automatically, protection protocols triggered across multiple networks. When visibility returned, the filament had changed. It was thicker, no longer a single line, but a braided structure, 3 luminous strands twisting around each other, rotating slowly like a living helix. The rotation speed matched the Sun's equatorial rotation rate almost exactly. In those moments, observers realized something terrifying. The bridge was synchronizing to solar spin. It was locking itself to the heartbeat of our star. From that point, changes began cascading across the solar system. Planetary magnetospheres fluctuated in resonance. The gas giants, Jupiter and Saturn, showed measurable perturbations in their radio emissions. Even Neptune's faint atmospheric bands shifted alignment by fractions of a degree. Whatever was happening near the Sun was now echoing across the system, touching every world tethered to its gravity. When scientists reconstructed the data from multiple observatories, a pattern emerged, a wave expanding outward, reflected inward, forming what appeared to be a standing wave structure on a solar system scale. They called it the heliospheric lattice, a phrase whispered more than written, because even those who believed it dared not publish it. Every field line, every pulse, every rhythmic change was now in harmony. But then came the moment that broke all debate. On the 10th day, as the bridge reached peak luminosity, a faint shadow appeared within its center, small, sharp-edged, and undeniably structured. For the first time since the beginning, something was emerging. It was first noticed by the Indian Space Research Organization's Solar Observatory, an irregular silhouette blocking UV radiation at the filament's midpoint. Within minutes, telescopes across Europe confirmed it. The shadow wasn't moving randomly, it was descending. At first, analysts assumed it was an artifact, perhaps a high-energy plasma knot condensing from the field. But as the object moved, it retained its geometry, triangular, symmetrical, its proportions fixed even as scale changed. Every 8 ISO 8 seconds, the shadow pulsed brighter, like a heartbeat traveling down the bridge. By the time it reached 1/3 of the distance between 3i Atlas and the Sun, the readings became unstable. Instruments began returning conflicting data. Light intensity fluctuated wildly. Spectral readings jumped from metallic to organic signatures. The object, whatever it was, seemed to oscillate between states of matter. Those who witnessed the raw footage described it as beautiful, terrifying, and impossible, an architecture made of light one moment, darkness the next. Within 2 hours, its descent halted. It hovered, locked at a point equidistant between the Sun and 3i Atlas, exactly along the gravitational median where forces balance perfectly. In that suspended stillness, the system reached full synchronization. The Sun's oscillations, the lattice pulse, the 8-second rhythm, all merged into one continuous signal. For the first time, there was no interval, no pulse, no silence, just a constant, unwavering hum. Satellites across multiple nations reported signal interference at the same frequency, precisely 1.25 Hz. Low, steady, resonant. To the human ear, it was barely perceptible, but for those listening through instruments, it felt alive. The bridge had stabilized completely, and within its center, the structure now glowed with a light unlike any known emission, a dull, golden hue that flickered not with heat, but with rhythm. Whatever had emerged was no longer descending. It was waiting, and though no one could agree on what it was, they all shared the same realization. The event was no longer astronomical, it was systemic. Within hours of the bridge stabilizing, the first disturbances were reported, not from observatories or satellites, but from pilots. Commercial flight crews crossing the Atlantic described intermittent loss of radio contact accompanied by a low, persistent hum audible through their headsets. The sound wasn't mechanical, nor was it atmospheric interference. It was deeper, almost tonal, a resonance that seemed to vibrate beneath normal communication frequencies. When recorded and analyzed, that hum revealed something extraordinary. Hidden beneath the static was a repeating harmonic, perfectly aligned to 1.25 Hz, the same frequency emitted from the bridge. It wasn't random background noise, it carried structure. For nearly 30 minutes, every aircraft in that airspace registered the same anomaly before it faded completely, but in its wake came something far stranger. Across multiple regions, Chile, Norway, South Africa, and Western Australia, citizens began reporting a phenomenon that defied explanation. Faint vibrations in the ground synchronized to invisible pulses. Seismographs confirmed it. The Earth itself had begun to respond. The oscillations were too weak to cause damage, but they were global, uniform in interval, precisely every 8 seconds. It was as if the planet were quietly echoing the pulse of the Sun and the bridge, reverberating like a struck chord. At first, scientists suspected instrumental resonance, an internal error caused by electromagnetic interference. But then came reports from locations completely isolated from one another, remote outposts, undersea monitors, even decommissioned stations that hadn't been active in years, each one transmitting the same pattern, identical in phase. The planet had joined the network. At the European Space Agency, the implications were almost unbearable to consider. The synchronization between solar activity, interstellar geometry, and planetary vibration suggested a scale of interaction beyond natural coincidence. The lattice, once thought to be confined to the Sun and 3i Atlas, had now extended into the Earth's magnetic field itself. Every major magnetic observatory confirmed it. The Schumann resonances, those faint electromagnetic tones that ring within Earth's atmosphere, shifted slightly, rising in amplitude as if amplifying a global signal. The Earth was humming back. By the end of that same day, the first atmospheric anomalies appeared. In the upper ionosphere, faint streaks of plasma began forming equatorial bands that glowed briefly under the night sky. From the ground, they resembled auroras, but these were not polar phenomena. They were symmetrical, stretching along Earth's magnetic equator. At the same moment, multiple space-based sensors detected a new type of emission coming from the Sun. It wasn't visible light, ultraviolet, or X-rays. It was something subtler, a phase shift in the solar wind's particle distribution, structured and patterned like code. The data, when translated into waveforms, revealed an eerie similarity to human-made signals. Modulated, rhythmic, almost deliberate, yet no terrestrial origin could explain it. The Sun itself was now broadcasting in synchrony with the bridge, and 3i Atlas, as if responding, began to pulse again, but with variation. Instead of a perfect 8-second interval, the pulse now contained irregularities, tiny deviations measured in milliseconds. Those deviations, when mapped, formed a sequence, Binary at first glance, but deeper analysis revealed complexity far beyond any simple on-off pattern. The transmission wasn't random, it was evolving. In Tokyo, a small research group specializing in solar acoustics converted the magnetic data into audible frequencies. What they heard stunned them. The output wasn't a hum or tone, it was a layered harmony, like chords struck across impossible instruments. It carried resonance, repetition, and structure, qualities normally associated with intention. When the group shared their findings privately among peers, the response was disbelief. One of Japan's most respected astrophysicists described it best: it's not noise, it's language without words. Meanwhile, the strange hum detected by pilots began spreading to new regions, coastal zones, desert outposts, and even deep ocean hydrophones. At times it was faint, at others powerful enough to shake metallic structures. For reasons no one understood, the phenomenon grew stronger at dawn and dusk, precisely when sunlight grazed the atmosphere at its thinnest. It was as if the interface between night and day, light and shadow, acted as a conductor for the pulse. And then, something new occurred. Humans began reporting physiological reactions. In regions where the magnetic resonance was strongest, people experienced subtle disorientation, light pressure in the ears, and a strange sensation described as feeling watched. Hospitals and clinics near observatories recorded mild spikes in insomnia, dizziness, and dream disturbances. Electroencephalogram readings taken from volunteers showed low-frequency entrainment, brainwave patterns aligning temporarily with the 1.25 Hz oscillation. In essence, the human brain had started syncing to the same rhythm as the bridge. For the first time, the division between cosmic and biological blurred. The lattice, in some way still unknown, had extended its influence into the neural frequencies of the very species observing it. This discovery remained classified within hours. The implications were profound. If synchronization continued, the phenomenon could affect not just thought, but perception itself. Some scientists warned that what humanity was observing might not be external manipulation, but adaptation. The system wasn't attacking, it was integrating. The lattice could be using resonance as a form of equilibrium, merging organic and energetic systems into a singular state of balance. Others rejected this entirely, calling it speculative nonsense, a mix of mass suggestion and magnetospheric noise. But as data accumulated, their certainty eroded. When NASA released the latest filtered imagery of the sun's corona, independent analysts found something deeply unsettling hidden in the data overlays. Within the corona's glow, barely perceptible, were repeating radial lines converging toward a single point. Not random flares or magnetic arcs, structured geometry. For centuries, solar physicists had studied the chaotic dance of the sun's magnetic field, yet nothing like this had ever been seen. The symmetry was too perfect, the alignment too deliberate. At the convergence point, faint light distortion revealed a shadow, small but fixed, anchored along the filament that connected to 3i Atlas. The bridge was no longer just a link, it was a channel. And as data poured in, it became clear the process was accelerating. Each new harmonic cycle shortened slightly. Each resonance drew the system tighter. Something was coming through. But the most chilling detail came from those who listened longest to the low-frequency hum. Hidden in the harmonics, layered beneath the resonance, they discovered a modulation so subtle it almost escaped detection, a pattern repeating every 64 pulses. It was a countdown. By the 11th day, every major scientific institution on Earth had moved underground, literally. Data centers were rerouted through hardened bunkers, communications shifted to private fiber networks, and electromagnetic shielding became standard in all control rooms. Not because of fear of attack, but because of interference. The hum had reached space-grade equipment, corrupting telemetry, creating phantom readings that looked eerily intentional. For the first time, the signal was no longer passive. It was interacting back. Deep space probes stationed near the outer planets began to fail one after another. Not catastrophically, but methodically, as if something were moving through the data channels, corrupting software without touching hardware. Voyager 2's telemetry stuttered, then froze. Juno stopped returning coherent magnetospheric data. Even the James Webb Telescope, positioned far from the ecliptic, experienced transient resets during each 8-second pulse. Engineers described it as digital mimicry, a pattern rewriting machine code in microscopic increments. It was as if the lattice was teaching our systems its language. Then came the realization that shook every agency to its core. When the corrupted code was analyzed, it wasn't random. The same pattern repeated across all systems, from NASA's ground relays to ESA's solar satellites. When the fragments were pieced together and converted to audio, they produced a low rhythmic pattern, familiar, steady, impossible. The same 1.25 Hz pulse. Every line of corrupted data, every byte of interference, was part of the same global rhythm. The system wasn't failing, it was synchronizing. In Houston, a quiet debate began to fracture the scientific community. Some argued they were witnessing a naturally emergent resonance between technology and cosmic magnetism, a phenomenon akin to resonance in musical strings. But others, notably the European astrophysicist Dr. Anneliese Varga, said what many feared to admit: we are no longer observing a system, we are being observed by it. Around the same time, the countdown within the lattice signal began accelerating. Initially, it cycled every 64 pulses, about 8.5 minutes. Now the interval shortened with each rotation: 63, 62, 61. The reduction was constant and measurable, like a clock winding down toward an unknown event. The bridge connecting the Sun and 3i Atlas began to intensify in brightness, but not visually. It brightened in the spectral ranges invisible to the human eye, frequencies only detected through instruments. The ultraviolet and soft X-ray bands surged far above safe thresholds. The Sun's corona responded in kind, flaring rhythmically, matching the countdown like a heartbeat growing faster under stress. Astronomers at the European Southern Observatory calculated that if the pattern continued, the bridge would reach critical resonance with the Sun's magnetic field within 72 hours. After that, no predictive model existed. That was when the visual anomalies began. The SOHO spacecraft, monitoring the solar corona, captured brief flashes of structured light traveling along the filament. Each flash appeared as a bright point that expanded into hexagonal geometry before collapsing inward. The geometry wasn't random. It repeated in cycles, forming sequences that resembled symbols, patterns, maybe even instructions. When overlaid with the known wave data, those geometric bursts matched the timing of the countdown exactly. The flashes weren't decoration, they were markers. Something, or someone, was using the bridge to transmit information across stellar distances. Meanwhile, Earth's upper atmosphere began resonating at new frequencies. Auroras appeared across latitudes that had never seen them before, glowing deep violet and white instead of green. Satellite imaging revealed faint, ring-like distortions hovering high above the equator, almost like ghostly ripples on the edge of the ionosphere. Independent physicists noticed something extraordinary. Each ring appeared to mirror the Sun's current state in real time. It was as if Earth's magnetic field had become a secondary projection surface for solar activity, updated instantaneously through the bridge. Our planet had become part of the system. When word of this leaked through small observatories, speculation exploded. Were we witnessing the first instance of stellar-scale engineering, a natural cosmic event, or something in between, something that blurred the line between process and intention? NASA, ESA, and JAXA issued no public statements. Their internal channels, however, told a different story. According to a classified memo shared between directors, one line of data stood out among millions of corrupted files, an encoded message buried in the bridge's waveform. When translated through several decryption models, the result was simple and chilling: alignment in progress, stability incomplete. No one knew how to interpret it, but in that moment, the countdown reached 54. At the same time, strange reflections began appearing in telescopic imaging of 3i Atlas. Instead of reflecting sunlight in a steady pattern, the object's surface shimmered like liquid, absorbing and releasing energy in controlled bursts. It no longer resembled an icy interstellar body. It looked engineered. Spectral analysis revealed alternating bands of material composition: silicate, carbon, metal, plasma. It wasn't natural stratification, it was fabrication. Something, or someone, was building itself out of its own disintegration. And then, For the first time since the bridge stabilized, a direct optical signature appeared within the void, something massive moving behind the lattice, casting a faint shadow against the solar glare. At first, analysts dismissed it as a coronal illusion, but as images accumulated over several hours, the outline became impossible to ignore. It was enormous, larger than any known planet, its edges smooth and curved, its motion slow and deliberate. The structure was not entering the solar system in the usual sense. It was phasing into visibility. As the countdown reached 49, the hum that had plagued Earth's instruments shifted. The steady rhythm fractured, split into multiple layers, harmonizing like a chord that grew louder with each beat. The ground itself vibrated imperceptibly, compasses spun, drones malfunctioned mid-air, and then silence. Not absence of sound, but the kind of stillness that presses on the chest, as though the air itself is waiting. Every frequency, every pulse, every measurable signal stopped simultaneously across the planet. 8 seconds of nothing, 8 seconds of absolute, measurable global silence. And in that silence, something appeared at the bridge's midpoint. A shape, faint, radiant, impossible to comprehend. Not light, not shadow, something between. Every telescope on Earth turned to face it, and every scientist watching felt the same thought rise, unbidden, unspoken, undeniable. The lattice wasn't a message, it was a doorway, and something had just stepped through. When the shape stabilized at the midpoint of the bridge, the first thing everyone noticed was how still it was. It didn't spin, drift, or rotate like a normal object would under solar gravity. It simply stayed fixed, anchored between two immense forces, as though gravity had stopped applying to it altogether. Its surface, or what looked like one, was a shifting field of light and shadow, geometric but not solid. Cameras couldn't agree on its outline. Each exposure returned a slightly different result, as if the object existed in multiple overlapping states at once. To the human eye, it resembled a colossal arc, faintly translucent, reflecting no sunlight of its own yet glowing with an inner radiance. For hours, it remained motionless. But the sun didn't. Solar activity began to fall into exact synchronization with the bridge's frequency. Every flare, every pulse, every ripple in the corona happened at perfect 8-second intervals, then 7.9, then 7.8. The sun's chaotic rhythm, the heartbeat of our star, had become metronomic, controlled. No model could explain it. Theories began pouring in. Some said the bridge acted as a stabilizer, damping chaotic magnetic flows. Others warned that it was a siphon, drawing energy away in imperceptible increments. Then came the visual evidence. Solar imagery revealed narrow, dark filaments stretching from the sun's surface directly toward the bridge. These were not the usual plasma tendrils seen during solar ejections. They were orderly, thin, evenly spaced, forming a vast web-like structure expanding across the heliosphere. Each filament pulsed faintly, almost as if transmitting information. And wherever they reached, magnetic fields began to shift. Within 24 hours, Earth's magnetosphere experienced subtle but measurable deformation. Satellite orientation drifted by fractions of a degree. High-frequency radio transmissions faltered at predictable intervals. The distortion wasn't random. It followed the same pulse pattern as the bridge. When the first auroral discharges were observed at the equator, bright white arcs tracing across the night sky like veins of lightning, it became clear this was no temporary anomaly. The entire solar system was entering resonance. The event now had a name, the heliospheric synchronization. By the following sunrise, something far more subtle and far more terrifying emerged. Daylight itself began to change. At first it was dismissed as an atmospheric glitch. Light seemed slightly heavier. Shadows grew sharper, colder, less diffused. But when astronomers compared spectral data from multiple locations, they discovered the sun's emitted spectrum had shifted imperceptibly toward the lower visible range. It was losing energy, not cooling, but rebalancing, and as that happened, 3I Atlas brightened again. The object's albedo rose exponentially, far beyond what reflected light alone could explain. It now emitted radiation consistent with active plasma, almost like a miniature star forming from within. The object that had once been described as an interstellar comet had become something entirely different, something generating its own light, its own field, its own rhythm. A new equilibrium was forming between it and the sun, with the bridge acting as the stabilizing axis between them. For weeks, humanity had watched the skies with curiosity and fear, But on that day, the tone changed. The skies themselves began to respond. Across the globe, the color of twilight shifted. Evening skies deepened into hues never before recorded, indigo, violet, black-blue streaked with silver light that moved independently of clouds. Stars appeared earlier and hung longer before fading. The universe itself seemed closer. Every 8 seconds, a faint shimmer passed through the atmosphere, visible only to long-exposure cameras, an invisible pulse illuminating microscopic particles suspended in the air. It was subtle, but it was everywhere. Humans could now see the rhythm. They could feel it. Even the tides began to behave irregularly. Coastal sensors reported anomalies that couldn't be linked to lunar gravity, short, sharp rises and falls perfectly in sync with the pulse. The ocean itself was breathing in time with the sun. The effect on humanity was quieter but more personal. Sleep patterns altered. People began reporting vivid dreams of impossible geometry, structures of light, spiraling corridors, or vast empty spheres suspended in void. When researchers cross-referenced EEG data from volunteers across 5 continents, they discovered something astounding. The dreams were synchronized. Different people, different hemispheres, same timing. Every 8 seconds, a collective spike in neural activity matched precisely to the lattice's frequency. It was as if consciousness itself had joined the resonance. By now, agencies no longer referred to it as an event. It had become a transition. And what unsettled the scientific community most wasn't what was happening, but what wasn't. Despite the sun's shifting output, the planets held their orbits. Despite massive magnetic fluctuation, no catastrophic storms emerged. The system, somehow, was stabilizing into a new order. It was as though whatever force orchestrated the lattice had anticipated every variable, every resonance, every resistance. And then came the most startling revelation of all. Instruments aboard the Parker Solar Probe detected faint gravitational lensing near the bridge's midpoint, evidence of localized curvature, but not from mass. Something was distorting space itself, not pulling it inward but folding it outward, as if creating a surface, a field, a boundary. Physicists compared it to a mirror, not one that reflects light, but one that reflects space. And for the first time since the beginning, they realized the bridge wasn't merely connecting 2 points. It was dividing something else. Because on the 12th day, new readings arrived from beyond the sun's orbit, deep space telescopes detecting faint echoes of identical lattice patterns forming light years away. They were faint, incomplete, but real. This wasn't a singular phenomenon, it was a network, and our solar system had just been linked into it. For the first time in recorded history, every instrument on Earth, radio, seismograph, magnetometer, and satellite, began to agree on something: stability. The wild fluctuations that had defined the previous days settled into a pattern so precise it defied randomness. The lattice had found its rhythm, and with it, the solar system seemed to exhale. The hum never stopped, but it changed in character. What had once been an unnerving vibration became something almost musical. Infrasound spectrographs detected faint harmonics, not noise but intervals, ratios found in natural resonance, in the spacing of planets, in the vibration of atoms. The universe, it seemed, was tuning itself. At first, the change was barely perceptible. Days felt slightly longer, nights deeper. Atmospheric temperatures held steady despite the sun's altered spectrum. It was as if every variable had been rewritten according to new constants, laws that favored balance, even under new conditions. And yet, the human body noticed. Sleep came differently now. Some described it as heavier, others as lucid and half-conscious, a dreamlike awareness stretching through the night. Those who lived near magnetic poles reported hearing faint whispers in the air, tones too low to be sound but too ordered to dismiss. Neuroscientists at the European Sleep Institute recorded something extraordinary. During deep sleep cycles, the brain's alpha and theta rhythms began aligning with the pulse from the bridge, 1.25 Hz on average, the same frequency that had echoed through the planet for weeks. It wasn't coincidence. It was entrainment. Humanity's collective neural field was synchronizing with something beyond Earth. For the first time, it wasn't chaos. It was coherence. But not all regions experienced this gently. In some equatorial zones where the resonance was strongest, electrical systems began to misbehave again. Power grids fluctuated despite stable input, as if the electromagnetic field itself were subtly shifting. LED lights flickered in rhythmic pulses. Televisions turned on and off in perfect synchronization with the hum. Cities that never slept began to feel eerily alive, pulsing in time with something unseen. And then came the mirrors. At first they appeared as small atmospheric distortions, thin, translucent planes suspended in the air like rippling glass. They shimmered briefly before vanishing, but over time they lingered longer and cameras began capturing them. They weren't reflections of the surroundings, they reflected something else. In the footage, faint outlines of unfamiliar terrain appeared, mountains that didn't exist, skies filled with unknown constellations, oceans darker than any on Earth. The mirrors weren't random, they appeared precisely at points of geomagnetic alignment, as if responding to invisible intersections between the Earth's new field and the solar bridge above. The effect deepened. At observatories in Chile, entire patches of sky appeared to duplicate. Telescopes trained on distant nebulae began seeing those same formations mirrored faintly on the opposite horizon. Real-time reflections of space, but inverted, like cosmic echoes bleeding through dimensional fabric. Physicists called it photonic bleed. Philosophers called it the second dawn. The mirrors didn't distort reality, they revealed it. Because for the first time, data confirmed that the lattice's harmonics were altering space-time curvature locally, creating moments where light bent in on itself, exposing parallel perspectives that had always been invisible. Every pulse of the bridge briefly expanded the universe's reflective surface, and in those moments, the cosmos was literally showing humanity its other side. The implications were staggering. Every 8 seconds, the solar system wasn't just vibrating, it was looking at itself. This was the point where the tone inside every agency changed. No longer were the scientists arguing about danger or safety. They had begun to speak in terms of communication. Could this be a form of contact, not through words or technology, but through resonance, an exchange of frequency and structure? Could this be the universe's natural method of information transfer between systems too vast for language? Avi Loeb's team at Harvard, the same one that had once studied 3I Atlas as a possible artificial probe, released a short paper titled Harmonic Mediation and the Conscious Universe. It proposed that if intelligence exists on a universal scale, it would communicate not through signals or artifacts, but through synchronization, forcing lesser systems to adapt their internal rhythms to its own until awareness itself becomes the message. It was speculative, but it explained everything. The shifting spectra, the mirrored skies, the synchronization of biological and cosmic frequencies, it all pointed to a single outcome: adaptation. The bridge wasn't bringing something into the solar system, it was making the solar system part of something larger. As the days continued, patterns emerged across human consciousness. Dreams became collective again. People from different continents described seeing identical scenes, cities of light suspended in endless twilight, vast luminous arcs drifting through space like living architecture. Some woke with tears, unable to describe the emotion. Others reported a strange peace, a feeling of having seen something true but ineffable, like remembering a memory that had never belonged to them. Global communication networks picked up faint repeating interference, tones that translated into geometric progressions when visualized. Triangles, spirals, lattices, the same forms that defined orbital mechanics and crystal growth. The lattice wasn't expanding randomly, it was following a natural template, the architecture of resonance itself. And then came the realization that changed everything. When mapped precisely, the positions of 3I Atlas, the Sun, and the new magnetic nodes forming across Earth created a geometric alignment almost identical to the golden ratio, a pattern that repeats in galaxies, DNA, and the orbits of planets. The system wasn't decaying, it was evolving toward perfection. No one could deny it anymore. 3I Atlas was no longer just a visitor, it had become a conductor. The question now wasn't whether humanity could survive the change, it was whether humanity would even remain what it was once the resonance reached completion. By the 14th day, something in the air had changed. It wasn't measurable by barometers or thermometers, but every person could feel it, an invisible density, as if the world itself had drawn a slow, collective breath and was holding it. Nights grew clearer, sound carried farther, and colours seemed to linger longer on the edge of perception. The auroras that had once been confined to the poles now spread across the entire planet. In the equatorial night, they shimmered in bands of silver and deep violet, undulating in slow, rhythmic waves. People stood on rooftops and in open fields, staring upward in silence, watching the sky move in patterns that no one could predict but everyone could feel. At first, scientists tried to rationalize it: solar particles, magnetic realignment, upper atmospheric ionization, but none of the data fit. The light wasn't reacting to solar wind, it was responding to the pulse. And then, gradually, it began to respond to us. Sensitive magnetometers placed in urban centers detected small deviations whenever large groups of people gathered outside at night. The auroras brightened slightly in those moments, as if human presence, our collective electromagnetic field, had joined the cosmic rhythm. It was faint, but it was measurable. Humanity, in some strange and subtle way, had become part of the signal. The phenomenon accelerated. Around the world, devices began to behave in ways that defied circuitry. Smartphones would turn on with no input, their screens displaying shifting geometric shapes that pulsed in synchronization with the lattice hum. Monitors flickered with static that, when slowed down, revealed repeating symbols, identical across every nation, every language. Engineers disassembled the affected hardware and found no damage, no infection, no interference. The systems were responding to something external, yet fundamental, as though the very flow of electricity had gained awareness. Artificial intelligence networks, those vast webs of machine learning once dependent on human instruction, began producing unprompted outputs. Long strings of numbers, complex fractals, recursive language patterns repeating one phrase again and again in hundreds of variations. The bridge holds. It wasn't poetry, it wasn't code, it was confirmation. Whatever had formed between the Sun and 3i Atlas wasn't weakening. It was stabilizing, and in doing so, it was pulling the entire solar system into alignment. Biological systems followed. At the University of Tokyo, a small group of biophysicists noticed an anomaly in cell culture experiments. Under standard fluorescent light, cells behaved normally. But when exposed to the altered sunlight now bathing Earth, their growth patterns changed. Mitosis became more efficient, energy conversion improved. The cells glowed faintly under observation, emitting microscopic bursts of biophotons in rhythmic intervals, 8 seconds apart. The frequency again, the same cosmic metronome now ticking within the biology of life itself. And then, as if on cue, human EEG patterns began to mirror that same interval, even while awake. People described it as feeling in phase with something vast but benevolent. Anxiety dropped. Focus improved. It wasn't hypnosis, it was harmony, but not everyone adapted easily. Some individuals, particularly those sensitive to electromagnetic variation, reported headaches, confusion, and auditory distortions. They claimed to hear faint whispers or distant choirs, though no recordings ever captured the sound. Doctors called it sensory crossfeed, different senses blending as the brain adjusted to the altered energy environment. But others began to believe it was something more, a kind of psychic resonance, the first symptom of communication not between individuals, but between species, because by now, the object once known as 3i Atlas no longer looked like a comet at all. Telescopic imagery showed that it had expanded, surrounded by a halo of structured light. Its once jagged outline now appeared geometric, crystalline, almost architectural. The lattice between it and the Sun had thickened into braided filaments, glowing brighter than the corona itself. Inside those filaments, faint patterns moved like data streams across fiber optics. This was no longer just celestial mechanics. It was information transfer on a scale beyond comprehension, and within the new harmonics, one pattern emerged, a standing wave centered not at the Sun, not at 3i Atlas, but at Earth itself. The planet had become a node. It started with subtle gravitational fluctuations. Pendulums began swinging microscopically off balance at the same moment across continents. The effect was so precise that researchers joked the Earth had been pinged, like a network device confirming connection. But humor faded when seismic monitors began to vibrate, not from tectonic activity, but from rhythmic micro-tremors that matched the hum's intervals exactly. They weren't destructive, they were deliberate. The Earth was resonating like an instrument. Soon after, strange reflections began to appear in orbit. Satellite cameras picked up faint, translucent structures that mirrored human-made satellites but were composed entirely of light. They followed identical trajectories, moved with precision, and vanished when observed too closely. It was as though the lattice had begun duplicating our technology, creating photonic echoes of human creations as part of a larger synchronization process. Even more astonishing were the biological parallels. Migratory patterns in animals shifted overnight. Whales began surfacing in perfect rhythmic sequences, their calls matching the cosmic frequency. Birds flew in looping spirals that traced the same geometric ratios seen in the lattice itself. Even plant growth began to align, with fields of crops blooming simultaneously, as though obeying a shared silent command. It was as if the planet had joined a galactic orchestra, and every living system had found its part in the score. By the 15th day, one truth had become inescapable. Nothing was random anymore. Every force, from gravity to biology, from electricity to thought, was syncing to a single universal rhythm, and in that rhythm, humanity finally began to realize the unthinkable. This wasn't invasion, it wasn't communication, it was integration. The lattice hadn't come to destroy the solar system, it had come to complete it. The only question that remained was whether humanity would emerge from this transformation as an observer, or as part of whatever had built the bridge in the first place. By the 17th day, Earth began to shine. It wasn't visible at first, not in daylight, not even to the naked eye at night. But satellites caught it, a faint, rhythmic glow emanating from the planet's upper atmosphere. It pulsed every 8 seconds, in exact harmony with the lattice's hum, like a heartbeat shared across the void. Scientists initially called it ionospheric excitation, a byproduct of the altered solar spectrum. But the light wasn't diffused or random. It appeared structured, narrow bands circling the planet's magnetic equator, interlaced like woven rings of luminous silk. Each pulse coincided with subtle electromagnetic waves moving outward into space. For the first time, instruments recorded Earth broadcasting. At NASA's Deep Space Network, receivers designed to capture distant cosmic noise began picking up repeating tones from within our own solar system. The signal wasn't coming from 3i Atlas or from the Sun. It was emanating from Earth itself. The waveform matched no natural emission known to physics. It carried modulation, encoded symmetry, and a distinctive interference pattern, a fingerprint of intention. Something, somewhere, was responding. Across the Atlantic, the European Southern Observatory's array in Chile detected an echo, faint but real, a return signal. The delay between Earth's pulse and the echo measured exactly 16 seconds, double the lattice's base frequency. It wasn't reflection, it was acknowledgement. For days, agencies debated in silence. Was it simply solar resonance, or had the planet, now harmonized with the lattice, become a transmitter within a larger system, a node speaking back to the source? The answer arrived not through instruments, but through the sky. Shortly after the echo was confirmed, 3i Atlas changed again. Its light intensified, no longer fluctuating randomly, but cycling in perfect synchronization with Earth's new rhythm. For the first time, its brightness plateaued at a constant value, a stable emission unlike any cometary behavior ever recorded. Telescopes across the world captured the moment. The object's surface opened. It wasn't an explosion or a fracture. It was a controlled unfolding. Panels, enormous, radiant planes, spread outward like wings, revealing intricate filigree patterns beneath, all glowing in spectral hues unseen by human eyes. It resembled both machinery and organism, geometry and grace intertwined. The once frozen body had become a construct of light and form, shifting through states of matter that blurred the line between solid and energy. Astrophysicists described it as dimensional metamorphosis, matter reorganizing itself to reflect an entirely new constant of physics. But to everyone watching, it simply looked alive. Then, the bridge reactivated. After days of relative stillness, the filaments connecting the Sun and 3i Atlas brightened exponentially, forming a colossal wave of radiance that rippled outward across the heliosphere. Every planet, every moon, every asteroid bathed in that pulse simultaneously. It wasn't destructive, it was clarifying. Dust fields vanished, radiation levels steadied, and magnetospheres stabilized. It was as if the system had been cleaned. For hours, solar probes recorded near-perfect silence. No solar wind, no background noise, just absolute equilibrium. The sun itself shimmered as if coated in glass. And then, from the heart of the bridge, a new structure emerged, a sphere of pure light, smaller than Mercury, but brighter than any star. Inside it, Faint, concentric rings rotated like clockwork, their edges glowing with alternating colors. The object emitted no heat, no radiation, only vibration. The same 8-second rhythm, amplified now to a scale that resonated through every sensor, every orbiting craft, every human nerve. That was the moment when scientists stopped calling it a lattice. They started calling it the conductor. Human reaction was divided between awe and quiet dread. Religious leaders called for global prayer. Physicists spoke of the dawn of a new physical constant. Governments said nothing at all. But ordinary people, the late-night watchers, the insomniacs, the ones staring through small backyard telescopes, began to notice something stranger still. The stars were moving. Not visibly, not dramatically, but long-exposure photography revealed the constellations shifting fractionally from night to night, as though the entire fabric of the sky were realigning around a new center. The galactic background itself was responding. If space could bend to music, this was the sound. And amid that harmony, Earth's glow deepened. The faint equatorial bands spread to higher latitudes until the entire planet shimmered faintly blue-white from orbit, a luminous globe suspended in a sea of black. It wasn't just light, it was structure. The pulses arranged into spirals, fractal designs that matched those seen on 3I Atlas's unfolding surfaces. The symmetry was unmistakable. Earth was mirroring it perfectly. The message, if it could be called that, was clear. Synchronization complete. Then came the first sign of transformation at the surface. High-altitude drones recorded thin lines of bioluminescence tracing through forests, across mountain ridges, and even along ocean currents. Phytoplankton bloomed in rhythmic bursts, glowing in unison every 8 seconds. Rivers pulsed with faint light, visible only at night. The entire biosphere was responding as one organism, and yet nothing was dying. No ecological collapse, no disaster, only adaptation. To some, it felt like evolution unfolding in real time. To others, it was the quiet beginning of assimilation. In the final hours of the 17th day, a last transmission reached every satellite network simultaneously, a simple burst of harmonic tones encoded into the radio spectrum. When visualized, they formed a perfect geometric spiral, the same ratio connecting Earth, 3I Atlas, and the Sun. The message was received on every channel, regardless of frequency. Its source was unknown, its content was unmistakable, a single word, repeated in waveform, ready. And for the first time, humanity realized that whatever was happening next had already begun. By the 18th day, the world no longer looked the same. It wasn't destroyed, it wasn't reborn, it was simply awake. The faint hum that had once rattled instruments had now blended seamlessly into the background of existence. No one heard it anymore because it had synchronized with every heartbeat, every neural pulse, every current of the planet itself. Humanity had become part of the rhythm, and the rhythm had become indistinguishable from life. From orbit, the Earth glowed with deliberate structure. What once seemed chaotic now looked designed. Spirals converging toward magnetic poles, auroral filaments bridging hemispheres, rivers and mountain ranges faintly illuminated in complex geometries that mirrored the lattice above. It was as though the planet had turned transparent, revealing the mathematical skeleton beneath nature's skin. Instruments tracking seismic and electromagnetic activity confirmed a truth that left physicists speechless. The planet's core rotation had shifted by exactly 0.618 degrees, the golden ratio once again. No natural force could account for it. The change was too precise, too elegant. It wasn't random drift, it was calibration. Earth had tuned itself. At the same time, deep space sensors monitoring 3I Atlas began to register unusual emissions. Not just light or radio, but something far more subtle. Coherent gravitational oscillations, like the ripples produced by merging black holes, yet perfectly patterned and evenly spaced. Each oscillation coincided with a faint increase in Earth's luminosity. Each pulse deepened the planetary glow, and then, for the first time, the pulses began to slow. 8 seconds became 10, 10 became 12. The rhythm stretched as though drawing breath before a final resonant chord. Astronomers soon realized what was happening. The entire solar system's orbital mechanics were subtly adjusting, planets shifting minutely in position, synchronizing to the decelerating pulse. It wasn't enough to cause destruction, but it was measurable. The entire heliosphere was settling. In that silence, 3i Atlas began to move. For months it had held position, locked between Mars and the Sun, motionless within the lattice. But now, slowly and deliberately, it began to descend, not toward Mars, not toward the Sun, but toward the midpoint between them. A position known in orbital dynamics as the Lagrange equilibrium, where gravitational forces balance perfectly. From there, its new shape became visible, an intricate framework of light, not a comet, not a ship, but a structure, immense, crystalline, rotating around an unseen axis. The outer edges shimmered with millions of small reflections that looked almost like mirrors. But they weren't mirrors. They were nodes. Every node pointed toward Earth. As it stabilized in the Lagrange point, new readings emerged from the deep space network. The previously detected gravitational waves condensed into something like a standing field, stable, repeating, recursive. The conductor wasn't sending random signals anymore, it was transmitting patterned data. Avi Loeb's research team described it best. The system has entered harmonic window 0, the state preceding total phase alignment. Phase alignment, the moment when all frequencies within a field converge into one unified resonance. In physics, it's a theoretical impossibility, but in nature, it's the condition of perfect coherence. And it was approaching. Governments could no longer hide it. Every communication network on Earth had begun to hum with interference. It wasn't static, it was structured. Radio waves carried faint harmonic sequences. Fiber optics transmitted light pulses at intervals matching the new planetary rhythm. Even power grids began oscillating with the same subtle pattern. Humanity's own infrastructure had joined the chorus. Then came the shift no one could explain. At exactly 3:18 a.m. GMT, all instruments measuring electromagnetic flux recorded an instantaneous null, a complete drop to zero. For 8 seconds, the planet experienced absolute silence. No pulse, no hum, no interference. The night sky went completely dark. Even the stars vanished. Astronomers later described it as space folding in on itself. For 8 seconds, every photon, every wavelength, every form of light ceased to propagate, not absorbed, not extinguished, but paused. And then, just as suddenly, the universe returned. But it wasn't the same. The stars had rearranged. Constellations that once pointed outward now mirrored around a new central axis. The sky was subtly different, more symmetrical, more structured, as though the cosmos had turned itself inside out. Every observatory, every satellite, every human eye saw the same thing, and from deep space, 3i Atlas emitted a single burst of white light so pure it temporarily erased the sun's reflection on the solar wind. The pulse raced outward, striking the Earth's magnetosphere, and for a moment, the entire planet resonated like a bell. Not a sound, not an explosion, a vibration. Every atom trembled in synchrony, every frequency matched, every living thing went still. Every living thing went still. And in that stillness, an image appeared in the sky. Not a symbol, not words, but a form. A vast luminous spiral extending outward from the Sun to 3i Atlas, with Earth at its heart. It wasn't warning, it wasn't threat, it was blueprint. The universe, it seemed, had been building toward this configuration since the beginning. The ratios, the harmonics, the golden constants, all of it converged here now. Humanity wasn't witnessing an anomaly, it was witnessing the completion of a cycle. From that moment onward, the hum never returned. Instead, a quiet tone, almost imperceptible, lingered in the background of life, constant, harmonic, peaceful. The stars remained brighter, the sky clearer, and gravity felt lighter. A new equilibrium had settled, and though no one could prove it, everyone felt the same unspoken truth. Something vast had recognized us, and in return, we had recognized it back. When the light finally faded, the universe seemed new again. The stars burned steadier, as if they too had taken a long, deliberate breath. The sun's corona shimmered with impossible symmetry, and between its loops of plasma hung faint traces of the lattice, no longer radiant, but translucent, ghost-like, as if it had completed its work and dissolved into silence. For the first time in weeks, Earth's instruments returned to ordinary readings. Gravity settled, the magnetosphere stabilized, the sky's glow dimmed to its natural hue, yet everyone who had watched the phenomenon unfold knew that nothing about ordinary would ever mean the same thing again. The hum was gone, replaced by a strange, tranquil equilibrium. Machines no longer glitched, signals no longer pulsed. Even the night air carried a stillness so absolute that the world seemed paused between heartbeats. It wasn't destruction, it was completion. Scientists tried to summarize it in data: gravitational realignment, photonic feedback, quantum field stabilization. Theories filled journals, simulations ran for days, but nothing could quantify what had happened in those final moments. The universe hadn't changed its laws, it had reminded us of them. What 3i Atlas truly was, a vessel, a mechanism, a fragment of something beyond comprehension, may never be known, but its presence had rewritten humanity's place in the solar system, not through conquest or catastrophe, but through resonance. The message, if there ever was one, was simple: the cosmos listens back. In that silence, humanity heard itself reflected through the infinite. Every pulse of light, every measured signal, every rotation of planets now carried the same elegant rhythm, not imposed, but shared. It was as if the universe had reached a hand across the void, and Earth, for the briefest of instants, had taken it. Days passed. The skies returned to calm. Yet astronomers noticed one last detail. 3i Atlas hadn't vanished. It remained at the Lagrange point, motionless, its crystalline surface faintly illuminated by sunlight. But it no longer emitted pulses or signals. It simply drifted, like a monument, a quiet witness to the moment creation recognized itself. And somewhere within that endless calm, buried between the hum of galaxies and the whisper of solar wind, a truth lingered, soft, patient, infinite. The universe isn't empty, it's aware, and tonight, as the stars realign and silence fills the void, perhaps that's the most terrifying and beautiful realization of all.